So today, we're going to dig into a really strange statistical puzzle that popped up right after the main waves of the pandemic. It's a mystery all about a very simple but incredibly important number, a country's death rate. And according to our source material, it's a puzzle that, frankly, hasn't gotten nearly enough attention. So, let's dive in.
All right, let's just start with a common sense question. After a massive global pandemic, one that so tragically hit the elderly and the most vulnerable people in our society, what would you expect to happen to the death rate in the years that followed? Just think about it for a second. What's the logical outcome?
You'd think, right, that death rates would actually go down. I mean, the tragic logic is that the pandemic had already taken so many of the most fragile people, so you'd expect a dip, a period of lower than normal mortality. But the reality? In many, many countries, the exact opposite happened. The death rates didn't fall, they went up. And that contradiction is the mystery we're exploring today.
Now, to really get a handle on this, we have to understand the main tool that scientists and statisticians use to measure this stuff. It's a term you might have heard, excess deaths. And believe me, it's the key that unlocks this whole puzzle.
So, what are excess deaths? Well, the idea is actually pretty simple. Imagine you know the average number of people who pass away in your country every week. It's a predictable number, more or less. Excess deaths are when you suddenly get way more than that average, and it makes you go, whoa, hold on, what's going on here? It's the number of deaths from all causes that's just above the expected baseline.
And figuring it out is pretty straightforward. It's just 3 steps. First, you look at a normal period before the pandemic, say 2015 to 2019, and you get an average. That's your baseline. Second, you just count up all the deaths that actually happened in the period you're looking at, like 2021 to 2022. And third, you find the difference. Whatever is left over, that's your excess. And this slide right here shows it perfectly. That bar on the left, that's what was expected based on those normal pre-pandemic years. Now look at that taller bar on the right. That's what actually happened in 2021 and 2022. You see that gap? That difference? That's the excess we're talking about. And according to our source, that gap was surprisingly large in places like the UK and the US. Okay, so now let's lay this all out on a timeline, because this is where things start to get, well, really interesting. When you map out the events of the last few years, a very specific, and some would say troubling, pattern starts to take shape. Okay, so here's how it unfolds. From 2015 to 2019, everything is normal. That's our baseline. Then 2020, the pandemic hits, and of course, you see that big spike in deaths, no surprise there. Then in 2021, the massive global vaccine rollouts get underway, and it's right after that, in late 2021 and through 2022, that we see this new, prolonged period of high excess deaths.
And this is where we get back to that head-scratcher from the beginning. As our source, Dr. John Campbell, lays out, after that huge wave in 2020, the expectation was for fewer deaths than normal. But that's not what happened. The numbers were actually higher. It just didn't add up.
So this is a really important point. Dr. Campbell is extremely clear on how to interpret this. He asked the question directly, does this timing prove the excess deaths were caused by the vaccines? And his answer is an emphatic no. But he says, and this is the key phrase, there are temporal associations. In other words, look, these 2 major events happened one right after the other. And he argues that this correlation is just too significant to ignore and deserves a much closer look. So that leads to a huge question, right? If you can see this correlation so clearly in the numbers, why is it still a mystery? Why don't we have a definitive answer? And the answer, according to our source, seems to circle back to one thing, the data itself, or the lack of it.
I mean, it's the obvious question, isn't it? When you see a statistical signal this big, especially when it comes to public health on a global scale, why wouldn't major health institutions be all over it, trying to figure out exactly what's going on? Well, Dr. Campbell points to some major roadblocks. First off, he says that public data, which used to be easier to get, is now becoming much harder to access. On top of that, the way some official data is collected has apparently changed. And get this, he points out that a really important health data office in the UK just stopped publishing its reports in 2023. Even trying to get info through official requests has become a real challenge.
And then you have to ask, who's going to pay to investigate this? According to our source, there's basically no financial incentive for governments or for pharmaceutical companies to pour money into research that specifically looks at this correlation. So the work, he says, is mostly being done by independent folks, often on their own dime.
So you've got less data, no official funding, and all of that leads Dr. Campbell to say something pretty blunt.
He says, "It's almost as if people had something to hide." Now, that's a statement that really captures the deep frustration and suspicion that's grown around this whole issue.
So where does all of this leave us? Well, it leaves us staring at a genuine unsolved mystery. We've got a case file with some things we know for sure, a whole lot of things we don't, and even more questions that, so far, haven't been answered.
All right, so let's just recap the case file here. Here's what we know, based on the source. Excess deaths went up unexpectedly in 2021 and 2022. We also know this rise in deaths happened right around the time of the global vaccine rollout. And we know that access to the official data has reportedly become more difficult. Now, for what we don't know the definitive cause. We have no idea how much any one factor might be responsible. And we don't have an official reason why getting that data has gotten so much harder.
So really, the bottom line is this. We're left with a major statistical anomaly that affects public health across the globe, but there's no big, fully funded official investigation happening to get to the bottom of it and find out precisely what's causing it.
And that really leaves us all with one final, pretty heavy question. A troubling correlation is sitting there in the data for all to see. But the large-scale research needed to understand it seems to have stalled, so whose job is it to find the answer? That's the unanswered question at the heart of this whole post-pandemic puzzle.